Vigilance is a keyword ability that makes it so a creature doesn't have to tap to attack. While the effect is as old as Magic itself, appearing on the iconic Sarah Angel in Magic's very first set in 1993, didn't actually get keyworded until 2004's Champions of Kamigawa. Since then, it's been an evergreen keyword, in other words, an ability that we see on several cards in every single set. While Vigilance doesn't make a creature better in combat or harder to block like most of the evergreen keywords, it does let a creature be effective on both offense and defense in the same turn cycle, something that makes Vigilance creatures particularly potent when you're in a close race. Vigilance can make a card really good. If you want to know just how good, check out my top 10 on the subject. But Vigilance alone isn't enough to make a card good, as we'll see in this video, where I give my picks for the 10 worst cards with Vigilance. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. As usual, for a card to end up on this list, it has to be bad in 40 card and 60 card formats, as well as in Commander, and it can't ever have been good. Basically, a card has to have been bad everywhere for its entire history, or I don't really consider it one of the worst cards ever printed. At number 10, I've got Windseeker Centaur. For 1 generic and 2 red mana, it's a 2/2 with Vigilance. While there are a few other 3 mana 2/2s with Vigilance that are also quite bad, this is the worst of them because instead of costing 2 generic and a color of mana, it costs 1 generic and 2 red. So it's harder to cast, and yeah. For Vigilance to matter, it needs to be on a creature that is at least somewhat efficient, otherwise it's pretty irrelevant that the creature doesn't tap to attack, because it's never going to be able to attack or block effectively. This card's got a pretty funny history too. It's actually a promo card that was only available as a Harper Prism book promo. Between 1994 and 1996, Wizards of the Coast released a bunch of books, the first novels that established Magic lore, and these books had a page at the back that you could fill out and mail in, and you'd get a promo card in the mail. And if you did that with the book Whispering Woods, you got Windseeker Centaur. Talk about a disappointment. Even back when the book was released in 1994, this wasn't a good card. One kind of funny thing is that with the book The Cursed Land, you got a random promo from the earlier books, and the most famous of those promos was Mana Crypt. Can you imagine sending that in and hoping to get the crazy powerful Mana Crypt only to get mailed back a hard to cast 3 mana 2/2 with Vigilance? Talk about brutal. At number 9, it's Ardent Soldier. For 1 generic into white, it's a 1/2 with Vigilance. That's a bad starting point, but wait, it has Kicker, and if you pay that extra 2 generic, what you get when you cast it is a 4 mana 2/3 with Vigilance. Normally, with Kicker, it's acceptable if both sides are a little bit inefficient, but both sides of this are too inefficient. It is an irrelevant body on turn 2 or turn 4, and that makes this an awful card with Vigilance. At number 8, it's Stonehorn Chanter. For 5 generic into white, it's a 4/4, a terrible starting point, but hey, it has an activated ability, an ability that also costs 5 generic into white. And what do you get once you have sunk 12 mana into this thing? Well, you can attack with a 4/4 that has Vigilance and Lifelink. And sure, you spend that mana across 2 separate turns, but this ability should really give the Chanter a bit of a stats boost too, like +2/+2 or something, for it to feel remotely playable, even in limited. Letting your opponent sink mana into this and then killing it in response to the ability is particularly backbreaking for them, and even when that doesn't happen, chances are good that there will be creatures in play that are way too big for the Chanter to attack in the first place. At number 7, it's Sarah Paladin. For 2 generic and 2 white, it's a 2/2, and you can tap it to prevent 1 damage to any creature or player. You can also pay 1 generic and 2 white to tap the Paladin to give a creature Vigilance until end of turn. A 4 mana 2/2 is not a good place to start, and both of these activated abilities are super weak, but the Vigilance ability is way worse than the damage prevention. 3 mana and tapping a creature is just way too much for Vigilance. It's true that the creature you give Vigilance to kind of replaces the Paladin tapping itself down, but as is the case with any card that grants Vigilance, the creature you give it to already has to be good, and that really narrows down how often this effect is actually meaningful. At number 6, it's Gatehound. For 2 generic into white, it's a 1/1, yet another horrible starting point, but if Gatehound is enchanted, it gives your whole board Vigilance. That upside is pretty good, but the Hound is asking for some pretty serious setup, and in the meantime, your opponent can just attack with their whole board against this woefully inefficient creature, and then once you do put an aura on the Hound to give your board Vigilance, there's not a whole lot preventing your opponent from 2-for-1ing you since you stuck an aura on such a small creature that has no protection to speak of. On top of all of that, it isn't like giving Vigilance to your whole board is ever going to be relevant on its own either. You need to have a good board that can take advantage, otherwise this effect is irrelevant. At number 5, it's Ironheart Chimera. For 4 generic, it's a 2/2 artifact creature with Vigilance. You can also sacrifice it to put a +2/+2 counter on target Chimera, and it gains Vigilance permanently. Visions has 4 Chimeras, and they're all 4 mana 2/2s with a keyword ability, although weirdly, Vigilance wasn't keyworded at the time while First Strike, Trample, and Flying were. Anyway, the design of all of these Chimeras is kind of cool, since they can all give a +2/+2 counter and their keyword ability to another Chimera. None of them are good, since they're all woefully inefficient and there just aren't very many Chimeras in Magic, but Ironheart Chimera is the worst of the bunch. This is because the other 3 are either more efficient for what they give you, like a 4 mana 2/2 flyer, or a 4 mana 2/2 first striker, and while the Trample one is also pretty underwhelming, at least giving +2/+2 and Trample to something at instant speed is kind of a big deal. +2/+2 in Vigilance, not so much, especially because to actually take advantage of Vigilance, you have to do it before you attack. So yeah, the design of these is pretty cool, but Ironheart Chimera is really bad. At number 4, it's Ghost Hounds. A 2 mana 1/1 Vigilance is simply not a creature that can attack on very many board states, but it does have a little bit of upside. When it blocks or becomes blocked by a white creature, it gains First Strike. Unfortunately, a 1/1 with First Strike isn't exactly going to strike fear into very many creatures. Basically, this is a good attacker or blocker only when your opponent has nothing but white X1s in play, and you probably don't need me to tell you that that situation isn't going to come up very often. At number 3, it's Rabid Wombat. We've seen some bad stat lines so far, but Rabid Wombat really takes the cake there, since it's 2 generic and 2 green for a 0/1 with Vigilance. It's hard to have a worse starting stat line than that. But to the Wombat's credit, it does have some additional upside. It gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. So to be clear, the plan with this awful 4 mana 0/1 is to slap a whole bunch of auras on it. I mean, sure, if you can do that, it is a huge Vigilance creature, but the starting point is so horrendous that you really don't want to be doing that. As already mentioned in the video, putting auras on a creature is inherently risky, and Rabid Wombat doesn't do anything to mitigate against it. In fact, it starts out so freaking small that it's likely extra risky to try to put auras on it in the first place. But believe it or not, there are 2 Vigilance cards that are even worse. This is because, at least with Rabid Wombat, it adds to the board. The same can't be said for the top 2 cards on this list, like our number 2 card, which is the aptly named Vigilance. For 1 white mana, it's an aura that grants, well, Vigilance. As I mentioned earlier, Champions of Kamigawa was the set where Vigilance finally became a keyword, and an evergreen one at that. I think they mostly printed this card to drive the point home and to say, look, this ability that we've been using 9 words on for more than a decade is called Vigilance now. Here's a card to really make that clear. Because they definitely didn't print this to be an actually playable card. We've already mentioned that auras are risky a few times in this video, and because of that, you generally need an aura to offer a pretty impressive boost, or at least replace itself, and this doesn't even get close. There's no universe where giving a creature Vigilance is worth a whole card, and certainly not worth the risk of 2-for-1ing yourself. Vigilance just isn't a keyword that is good enough for that to be all the card does. Even if you put this on a creature that's already good, the upgrade isn't that impressive, and if you don't have a creature that's already good, it's entirely useless. As a result, this is one of the worst Vigilance cards and one of the worst auras of all time, but I think there's one Vigilance card that's even worse, and that card is Arkham Slay. For 1 generic mana, it's an artifact with an activated ability. You can pay 2 generic and tap it to give a creature Vigilance until end of turn. If the card stopped there, how bad would this card be? Well, pretty bad, for many of the same reasons that the aura that grants Vigilance is. It's just not a powerful enough keyword to make spending mana and a card on worth it. So even if we don't look at the last sentence in the text box, Arkham Slay probably still would have been on this list, although I may have put Vigilance, the aura that is, ahead of it. But Arkham Slay is even worse because it does have that last sentence which says you can only activate the ability during combat and only if the defending player controls a snow land. In other words, you can only give the creature Vigilance just before attacking, giving it a very narrow window, but that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the fact that if your opponent isn't playing a snow deck, this card does nothing. While the flavor here makes sense, they made this card flavorful at the cost of making it one of the worst cards in Magic, and certainly the worst Vigilance card that has ever been printed. So those are my picks for the 10 worst Vigilance cards in Magic. Do you want to prove me wrong by using these cards to attack without tapping anyway? Then check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on the more than 760 other MTG Top 10s, including dozens that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.